Right, today we are really happy to welcome Jill Rapley, Dr. Jill Rapley, because you have a PhD where
Mhm.
you looked at comparing spoon feeding with self-feeding from the baby's perspective. You are a former health visitor, a midwife, breastfeeding counsellor, but you're very best known, I think, for your approach to baby-led weaning. So could we start perhaps looking at when babies should start to wean at all to solid food?
Right. Well, actually, we'll just step back even and start slightly earlier than that and just be sure we know what we mean by the word wean, because it has different meanings in different
Absolutely.
countries. But also, even within the UK, certain groups use it differently. So we're talking here about the beginning of weaning. I am happy with the word weaning to refer to the introduction of solid foods, as long as it doesn't refer only to that. I see weaning, the beginning of weaning, as the very first bite of something other than breast milk or formula milk, and the end of weaning as the end of milk feed. So weaning is actually a very long process. But baby-led weaning is concerned with all of it, but primarily with the beginning, because that's the bit that babies so rarely get a say in, get a chance to have their view heard, if you like. So I'm sort of speaking for the baby in a way. When should it start? Well, that's changed a lot over the years, but we do now have some very sound science which says, do you know what? 6 months is about right. It varies from baby to baby, but really they've been trying to show us this for forever. 6 months is when they are able to, most babies, to sit upright, not necessarily unsupported, maybe with a bit of support around their hips, but they can hold their head and trunk upright. They can reach forward without toppling over, grab something, and what do? They bring it to their mouth. They're also beginning to munch and chew. So these are very clear signals that this is when they're ready to move on to solid food. The problem in the past is that we thought babies needed foods earlier than this. Now we know they don't, but we thought they did. And so the only way to get it into them when they can't do it for themselves is to puree it and give it by spoon. So we got in the habit of doing that. And the most recent age we were given was 4 to 6 months. As I say, now we know that nearer 6 months is about right. So we really don't need the puree bit. That was only there to enable us to give foods to babies who we now know were too young to have them. So the whole puree spoon feeding thing is a bit of a legacy from the past. 6 months is when babies are ready for solid foods. From 6 months, some babies are not needing anything much at all in the beginning, and many babies take several weeks, maybe a couple of months, to really start to eat. But that's fine, because breast milk and formula milk are enough until 6 months, and they're almost enough for a lot longer after that, and they're still hugely important at a year. So we talk about really the 6 to 12 month period as being a very gradual transition, a gradual changeover, so that at 1 year they're still very largely reliant on their milk feeds, but they're having quite a lot more family foods as well.
So you said there that it's changed over history, and you'd mentioned that 4 to 6 month period. I know many people recall that and say, well, I was weaned at 4 months, or the rules have only recently changed. It is actually quite a lot longer ago than many people think, isn't it, though, that 4 month weaning suggestion from health visitors actually changed to the 6 months?
Absolutely, yes. It was in 2002 that the World Health Organization said it's really 6 months is the age, and 2003 that we adopted that position in this country. So that's 17 years ago. And interestingly enough, that overlaps quite well with when baby-led weaning came to the fore. Not a coincidence, because once 6 months was the accepted age, in theory, even before it became so in practice, from my perspective, that was when baby-led weaning became so clearly sensible and the obvious way to go. I would like to say that baby-led weaning has come of age now. It's 18 years old, so this is a long time ago. The 4 to 6 months dates back further than that, up to 1974 definitely, and then it was kind of updated in the later years. What's been lost in when people talk about that is the fact that 6 months was always there. 4 to 6 months was the message right back since the mid 70s. In practice, a lot of people went for 4 months. What I think many people interpret it to mean was that if you did it any time between 4 and 6 months, you were going to be okay, that your baby would be fine. And that's what a lot of professionals seem to be saying. What actually the message was that sometime between 4 and 6 months, your baby will be ready. And we now know that, in fact, the vast, vast majority of babies are going to be ready nearer to that 6 month mark or just after. But 6 months was always there as an option. It's just that very few parents were encouraged to wait that long.
And so parents can choose to use baby-led weaning or puree, but can we just have a little definition of what those both mean, I think, before we go on?
Yes. Baby-led weaning is kind of more of an ethos or an approach to the introduction of solid foods. It's not a practical method as such. So it's about a lot more than purees and spoon feeding. In fact, I was giving a talk recently and I realized that the slide I used to give the basics of baby-led weaning didn't mention the word spoon or puree at all. It's about respecting babies, respecting what they can do, going with their development instead of fighting against it, and trusting them to know what they need. Now, what that means is putting them in control of the process. And it's at that point that we can see that if somebody else is holding the spoon, then that person is in control. So it's not spoons and purees per se that are a problem, it's that they're usually wielded by the adult. When it comes to babies feeding themselves, they can't manage a spoon at 6 months and they can't really cope with purees because a lot will manage with their hands, to be fair, but it's quite messy. But so the ideal foods to start them on are not purees, and the ideal way for them to get it to their mouth is not with a spoon. They want larger pieces of food that they can pick up. So if we're going to put the baby in control, we really need to let go of the spoons and purees. And that's why baby-led weaning is seen in that light. But actually, it's more about who's in control and who's making the decisions.
So, could we look at what are some of the pros and cons of babies eating purees or mushy foods and babies eating finger foods?
Well, the very short answer to that is that the pros with baby-led weaning are very much for the baby, with quite a few for the parents as well. The cons with spoons and purees are almost all cons for the baby, but and very few cons for the parents. So the big difference between the two is who's in control and who's comfortable with that. A lot of babies just don't want to be spoon fed. They won't have it, especially starting at around 6 months when they're a little bit more able to resist than they would be at 4 months. So they're more able to show what they want to do, and that of course can mean that they start to refuse to be fed. This is a big con for the parents, and the risk is that the baby will then be cajoled or forced into eating. One of the big problems with spoon feeding and purees is that the baby isn't required to chew. There's an idea that the purees teach babies to chew, or that they have to learn on purees first before they can move on to chewable foods. You don't chew purees. Purees almost get swallowed very much like a liquid, which is why we could give them to babies who were too young to be chewing. Once a baby's chewing, it seems that babies then default to a natural chewing when they have something in their mouth, and they can actually find purees quite difficult because, I mean, try chewing a puree, it just sort of splurges all over your mouth. So purees can be quite tricky. Another problem with purees is that because they're swallowed quickly, it's very, very easy to eat more than you need. Most of us need a period of chewing and swallow slowly and so on to let our stomach feel full and to tell our brain that it's full. We know for adults that if we eat quickly, we intend to eat more because we're not getting those fullness messages. So it's ever so easy to overfeed a baby with purees. And because they're swallowed so quickly, usually there's very little pause between spoonfuls, the next one's in. And although babies can say, no, I don't want any more, and if they're being fed responsively, which we would hope, and sensitively, then the parent or whoever's caring for them is looking out for that. But most babies are very keen to please too, and so probably they had already had enough a couple of spoonfuls ago. So for various different reasons, it's very easy to overfeed a baby with purees. And we know that tends to happen. They do tend to eat a lot more than babies who are feeding themselves. Babies who are feeding themselves are aware of their appetite and they work according to it. And when they've had enough, they just stop. They don't have to signal to anyone to stop doing something to them. They just stop eating. Of course, this is one of the things that can make parents worry. Is he getting enough? And many parents who do some spoon feeding and think that they're doing baby-led weaning the rest of the time actually are just overriding their baby's signals and ensuring that he eats what they think he should instead of what he says he should. Because we have this risk with spoon feeding that it's easy to overfeed, this can sometimes happen to parents who are doing baby-led weaning but are concerned that their baby isn't eating enough, because baby-led wean babies manage their own appetite and stop eating when they've had enough. And they offer them spoonfuls to sort of top them up at the end of a meal. But that again can just mean that they eat too much. We have to trust babies and believe them when they say, no, I don't want any more. Other pros and cons, I guess the biggest problem, if you like, or disadvantage of baby-led weaning is the mess. I mean, there really can be quite a bit of mess at first. Having said that, many parents have said to me, do you know what, it's easier to pick up pieces of broccoli and potato off the floor than to pick up green sludge off the walls. So where a baby's really not happy being spoon-fed, they can make a huge mess. But I think it's important to recognise that baby-led weaning is not just about food. In fact, food is a minor point, especially early on from the baby's point of view. It's about learning, it's about discovering the world. Food is the best educational toy that there is. You know, we have toys that squeak and scrunch and different colours, and then they make noises, they have different textures. But I don't know of one that produces juice when you squeeze it. Now that's amazing. This is the best messy play you could ever have. And babies are able to do it at 6 months. So yes, it's going to be a bit messy, but then so is a lot of learning. And what so many parents say is, do you know what? He feeds himself very cleanly by the time he's 10 months, 12 months, much more so than his counterparts who are only just moving over from spoons to feeding themselves. So it's short-lived and it's messy for a good reason. And we need to allow babies to explore food. Very important too, from the baby's point of view, that they explore it before they eat it, because that way they know it's safe and they also know how to recognize it next time. If you're just presented with a bowl of kind of green or orange mush, it could be anything. It could be, you know, the orange one could be mango one day and carrot the next. And then we expect babies to trust food and be adventurous when we're almost tricking them at every meal. When they do baby-led weaning, they really learn how to recognize foods by their size, shape, color, texture, smell, and they can get properly acquainted with it before they get as far as eating.
You mentioned that some parents can be worried about their baby-led weaned babies not having enough food. What are some of the other common worries that parents present with when they're thinking about baby-led weaning?
I guess the biggest one has to be choking. We're terrified our babies are going to choke. It hasn't been borne out. The research shows that there's no greater risk of choking with baby-led weaning than there is with spoon feeding and purees. If anything, there are some suggestions that baby-led weaning might help babies learn to manage food in their mouths from the beginning in a much more useful and safe way. Babies who've got used to swallowing purees very quickly often try and do the same when they're presented with more sort of chopped up foods, that sort of thing. It's the difference between slurping tomato soup, smooth tomato soup, and how you eat your breakfast cereal. You use a different technique. If you try and apply the slurping technique to your muesli or your cornflakes, there's a big risk of choking. So it seems that babies who are baby-led weaned possibly are learning oral skills earlier than some of their fellows. We also find that because babies are exploring the food with their hands before they get it to their mouth, that tells them a lot about the food's shape and texture and how it's going to behave inside their mouth. Most of us faced with a new food would perhaps poke it with a fork to see what sort of texture it is. Is it kind of rubbery like a mushroom, or sort of soft like a watermelon? You know, that tells us something about how it's going to behave when we put it inside our mouth. And babies who are allowed to handle food are learning that. And that may be one of the reasons why they don't struggle in the way that people fear they would. The other possible reason is that they start with the food at the very front of their mouth. And because at, let's say, 6 months, they haven't yet developed the ability to move it to the back of their throat, after they've chewed it, often it just falls out. So their own development, provided they're sitting upright and provided they're the one in control of what goes in their mouth, will tend to keep them safe. I think probably choking and the mess are the big worries that parents have. Interestingly, some parents worry that their babies will eat too much. When my colleague Tracy and I were in Japan, we found that actually that was a very common worry there. But you're right that in this country, we worry that babies won't eat enough. And we need to recognize that our ideas of the amount that babies need are a bit distorted. Distorted by the idea that you would start at 4 months, so therefore by 6 months your baby's going to be on 3 meals a day. That has given us a way of thinking that we now know isn't correct. But also because the commercial baby foods come in a certain size jar or a certain size pouch, and the implication is that your baby needs to eat all of that, which of course he doesn't at all.
And talking about those jars and pouches, we've talked about why babies should start weaning around 6 months of age. Why is 4 to 6 months food even on the shelf still, if it's 20 years, almost 20 years old that those guidelines have changed?
Because our laws haven't changed in line with that. The World Health Organization's International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes does cover foods presented for babies under 6 months, but that is just a voluntary guideline in this country. We don't have it enshrined in our law. So simply the companies can, and so they do. And of course, from a commercial point of view, the earlier you can get someone buying your products, the more you will eventually sell them, and you'll tend to have them hooked on your brand for life. So if one company is going to offer foods for 4 months old, you can be sure that most of them will want to do the same.
So if parents are going to choose not to use purees, either homemade or from the shelves, what are some good ideas for some first tastes in a baby-led weaning ethos?
Well, there is no need to start with anything in particular, because by 6 months, most babies have a robust digestive system, so they can manage most foods. It's our convention to start with fruits and vegetables, and nowadays people talk about starting with vegetables first so that we don't encourage too much of a sweet tooth. But actually the first nutrients that a baby is likely to need from 6 months onwards are iron and zinc, and the best sources for that are meat, or if one is vegetarian or vegan, then pulses and the sort of vegetables that have those nutrients in. Now, they're not the most obvious to present to a baby who's going to pick up food with his hands. It's very easy to chop vegetables into the sort of shape a baby can manage, which needs to be sort of a finger shape, sort of a bit like an adult finger, about that shape and size. It needs to fit inside the baby's fist. He needs to be able to close his fist around it, but not so small, not like a little tiny strip of julienne carrot, a decent sized, finger-sized chunk, with a bit sticking out, because what he can't do at 6 months is to open his hand and get the food into his mouth. So that sort of size and shape is relatively easy for vegetables, especially root vegetables, and for a lot of larger fruits. It's not so obvious what you could do with meat, but in fact it's very possible to cook meat slowly and have it quite sort of meltable in soft chunks, or to offer meat on the bone, obviously not with sharp bones, but a chicken drumstick, or to tear chicken into strips. That works very well. Or to make kind of homemade patties or burgers, which you can make into a finger shape. So there are quite a few ways to offer meat, for example, to babies. And things like pulses, lentils, they can be made also into patties or little balls that babies can pick up. Those would be my best first foods, but essentially it should be whatever the family is eating. So what one hopes is that the family is going to, if necessary, alter their diet so that whatever they eat is also going to be able to be shared with their baby. Because the other big philosophy part of baby-led weaning is that families eat together and babies share meal times, and that way They learn from their parents which foods are safe, how to tackle those foods. They learn the table manners that are acceptable in their household. And they can have conversations and just generally chill out together the way that families like to do. It also gives the baby plenty of time to eat. What often happens in households where spoon feeding is common is that the baby gets fed first so that everyone else can sit down and eat afterwards. And that can lead to the baby being rushed. With baby-led weaning, the baby has the same time frame as everybody else and is able to enjoy their food that much more.
So to sum up, do you have any top tips for either maternity nurses supporting parents or parents themselves on starting weaning with their baby?
I think look forward to it with enjoyment, positively. It's going to be a lovely experience for the baby. Think of it in terms of play and exploration rather than eating. Keep the milk feeds, be they breast or bottle, going on in the background as they always have. It's best when you sit a baby up to eat with the family that they're not hungry, and that seems to go against the general advice around how to start solid foods. But you have to remember that for the baby, this isn't about eating. His frame of reference for eating relates to his milk feeds. He has been watching his parents and those around him eating for a while probably, and is fascinated by it, but he doesn't have any way to translate what he sees into the feeling of a full tummy. So if he's hungry and he's presented with food instead of his milk feed, he's not going to want to play the game. He's not going to be interested. In the same way that you wouldn't present a child with a new toy when they're hungry or when they're tired, in fact. So he needs to be in one of these nice alert states where he's interested in what's going on around him, and he's not needing anything else. Then he's open to these new experiences and can play, and he will discover gradually that this food fills his tummy, but that will take months before that penny drops. It's not how he's going to approach it from the start. So think of it as play and learning. Don't relate it to the milk feeds. Let them go on in the background. Offer a meal time when in between feeds, if you like, or relatively soon after a milk feed if the baby's nice and alert. Prepare the floor for any mess, preferably with something that's clean, a tablecloth or plastic sheet, so that the food can be picked up and handed back to the baby. That will cut down on the waste. And have your own meal alongside and make conversation with the baby. Smile, enjoy it, and just revel in his discoveries, or hers. Sorry, I keep saying he. It's just a habit, but I absolutely mean her as well.
We assume you're talking about all babies. Thank you so much for your time today, Jill. That's been hugely informative. And of course, you've got books that people can refer to for further learning, haven't you?
Absolutely, yes. Tracy Merkitt and I wrote the first book that there was about baby-led weaning, and that's still a very useful one to have as your starting point, called Baby-Led Weaning, Helping Your Baby to Love Good Food. We also have a couple of cookbooks and some books on breastfeeding and parenting.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Bye.